Story. Luffy had been awake for a while, listening to Nami's story. Don't ever forget that name. One day, this guy is going to be the king of the pirates. Luffy opened his eyes to stare at his navigator. Her eyes were filled with adoration. He felt his face heat up, although he doubted anyone would notice because of how pale he was at the moment. You know, he piped up, startling Nami, who went pink with embarrassment after realizing her captain had heard every word she had said. She turned away. The children, who were wide-eyed in awe, turned to Luffy, who slung an arm around Nami's shoulders, grinning. This lady is our navigator, and she's the best in the world. She can predict the weather, Luffy said. The children all looked from Luffy to Nami in amazement. Then one of them stepped forwards. So you have a bounty of 100 million berry, right? He asked. Luffy nodded. The kid then pointed to Zoro, who was still playing pool and doing his best to ignore the stares. And him, 60 million, what is he? Luffy grinned. Well, he's Roronoa Zoro. Comprehension dawned in the kids' faces as their jaws fell open. Luffy continued. He's our swordsman, and a pretty damned good one at that. He wants to defeat Hawkeye Mahawk and become the world's greatest swordsman. I'm sure he will someday. The kids continued pointing out various members of the crew, and Luffy continued to explain who they were. Nami zoned out, still pressed against her captain's side with his arm around her shoulder. The kids had gone to their parents while dinner was being served. Everyone had begun to queue up. Sanji had gotten himself into a competition with the lady from the bar, and so everyone was trying their dishes to say who won. Luffy didn't move from where he was, as Nami was zoned out and he didn't feel the need to disturb her. He was hungry, but he knew he shouldn't eat before the villagers because he'd eat everything. Plus, the weird food that lady had given him had, somehow, filled his bottomless stomach enough that he wasn't desperate. And so he sat there, for once not joining in with the party. His stomach still hurt like hell and he knew Chopper couldn't do anything more for it, plus, he was still exhausted from carrying Nami through the forest. The serenity of the corner was disturbed when Sanji appeared with a plate of steaming food he had prepared for Nami. He gawped down at Luffy for a second before his mind seemed to process what was going on. During that time, Nami came around and looked up at Sanji, and, upon noticing his look, seemed confused. Then she realized her current position, curled up against her captain, and went red, hurriedly standing up and taking the food. Luffy just laughed. It was at that moment that the doors crashed open and a silhouetted figure stood in the arch. The room went silent. Children were called back to their parents. The people huddled into tighter groups. Luffy looked up at the figure in the doorway, picking his hat up and placing it on his head. The figure scanned the room, his eyes landing on Zoro where they stopped. He turned and muttered something to a man standing behind him. Then he stepped forwards into the light. He was a tall man wearing an unbuttoned white shirt. His browny orange hair was pulled back into a man bun, and one of his eyes was covered by an eye patch. He smoked a cigar. You, he said, pointing at Zoro. You look familiar. Zoro met his gaze, completely calm. Threatening, almost. I just have one of those faces, he replied, leaning on the queue again. A little kid ran up to the man and tugged on his shirt. The man looked down on him and sniggered, disgust evident on his face. Promoted stories. You'll also like A Second Chance One Piece fanfiction. 383k 8.8k. Complete. Finally, after years of fighting, Monkey D. Luffy arrives at Lawtail and becomes Pirate King. But, he has lost a lot to get here. All of his friends are Dia. Broken Hearts Doflamingo X Reader. 4.4k 325. A woman who has had several adventures with her crew has recently encountered an island that would bring her and her crew into ultimate doom. Losing her captain and her. Let me help you. A Luffy x Nami fanfic. 209k 2.5k. After Luffy's battle with Doflamingo at Dressrosa, Luffy is now once again reunited with Sabo. Reuniting with Sabo somehow made Luffy remember about Ace and Hadarioke. One Piece. The alternative revision. 1.1k 30. The story will be changed but in future. Still the storyline same just bit change since there will be character insert into the story changing the timeline disclaimer. My brother's keepsake, Sabo X Reader. 125k 4.8k. After the death of Portgas D. Ace, the Navy wished to prevent the continuation of the bloodline of the Pirate King. They send soldiers to an island on the Grand Line where unexpected love. 1030. Monkey D. Luna is no ordinary girl. She was born different. She can manipulate plants' life. She is the twin sister of Monkey D. Luffy. Like her brother, she wants to be mysterious girl on the Straw Hat Ship 1. 6.3k 337. YN, a kind, lovely and beautiful girl who died while saving puppy god transmigrat into world of pirates. She also have unique power, as long as she wish any anime power. What do you want? He barked in his gruff voice. The kid seemed mortified. He pointed at Zoro, shivering. That man is Roronoa Zoro. He's part of the Straw Hat Pirates. The captain's here as well. They have massive bounties on their heads. The man stood up, shocked. Then he chuckled. So you Roronoa Zoro, he said. Zoro nodded. That's right. The man continued to sweep the room, then he grinned. Say, swordsman, introduce me to your friends. Zoro shrugged. I guess. That there's Tony Chopper, the ship's doctor. He said, gesturing to the small reindeer that was hovering nearby. As the attention turned to him, Chopper ran and hid behind Zoro. The swordsman picked him up and placed him on his shoulders. The man laughed. You mean that cute little thing is your doctor? He wheezed. Hey, Chopper squeaked. He clambered down from Zoro's shoulders and rose into his human form, heavy point. Who are you calling little? The man backed off, gawping up at Chopper in complete awe. Devil fruit. He muttered. You're a zone type. Chopper nodded. The man shook his head and turned back to Zoro. Wow, so far you guys seem interesting enough. Continue. Zoro placed the tiny Chopper back on his shoulders before he continued. There's Usopp. He's our sniper, liar and mechanic. He pointed to Usopp, who had been talking to the children, telling them about their adventures. The man nodded. And then there's those three, he said, pointing to the corner. Blackfoot Sanji, the cook, Nami, our navigator, and our captain, Monkey D. Luffy. Luffy watched the man carefully as Zoro introduced the crew. By the time he turned to face the three of them, Luffy was staring right back, his eyes shaded by his hat. He had decided that he didn't like this guy, and he was making sure the man could see that. The man strode forwards. Sanji, Nami, and Straw Hat Luffy. Tell me, Straw Hat, this kid tells me you and that swordsman have quite considerable bounties on your heads. Mind telling me how much you're worth? Luffy raised his gaze and grinned up at the man. Sure thing. Zoro, there's got an 80 million berry bounty. Mine's 100. The man looked shocked. His is 80 million, he yelled. Zoro chuckled. It's mine you're surprised with. He laughed. The man nodded. Well, yeah, 100 berry is pathetic. There was a pause, and then the entire Straw Hat gang started laughing. You think, Nami wheezed, the government would give someone capable of defeating one of the warlords a 100 berry bounty? The man froze. Wait, what do you mean defeated one of the warlords? He asked, his cool demeanor suddenly gone. The entire group was staring at the Straw Hats and the man with shock on their faces. Apparently it was not a common thing for this guy to be laughed at. His bounty is 100 million. Chopper wheezed, also chuckling. The man paled. 100 million. He stumbled forwards. The group behind him came into view as the doorway was cleared. They poured in around the man who appeared to be their leader. The man seemed to recover from the initial shock and stood up straighter. "Well, you don't scare me," he said, grinning. "I am, after all, the only son of the famous pirate red-haired Shanks." The crew gasped as they heard the name. They hadn't heard much of Luffy's past, but this name they recognized. Luffy eyed the man carefully, and then started cracking up. "Ha ha, Shanks, son," he laughed, keeling over and clutching his lungs. "Oh, man, that's funny," he said, recovering. "First of all, what's your full name?" he asked. The man met his gaze. "Judah Shanks," he said. Luffy nodded. "Well," he said with a quizzical face on. "That's funny." He winked at Nami. "You see, Shanks is Shanks' first name, not his last one." The man paled, but Luffy wasn't done. "Also, I happen to know that Shanks never had any children of his own. Only his adoptive daughter Yuta and me." The man turned to his men, who looked at him, wide-eyed in shock. It appeared that this man's lifelong lie had just been busted. Zoro watched his captain toy with the man in the doorway. He found some things of interest in the conversation. This included Luffy's claim that he was close to Shanks. What did he mean by that? Was he even telling the truth? Zoro had heard that name come up during his time on Luffy's crew, and he knew that Shanks was the one who had given Luffy his hat, and so he must have been an important figure, but this information was still quite revealing. If Luffy was not Shanks' biological son but was still the closest thing to it, meaning Shanks thought of Luffy as a son, did that mean Luffy thought of Shanks as a father figure? And what did that mean about Luffy's actual father? Zoro pulled himself out of the thought train and focused on the scene in front of him. It seemed that Luffy had embarrassed this guy quite a lot, and he was getting mad. "This'll be interesting," Zoro muttered. The man visibly calmed himself and strode up to the group in the corner. His gang followed obediently behind him, guns drawn. The citizens all kept a wide berth. Zoro handed his cue to a nearby man and went to retrieve his swords, just in case. The group around the pool table watched him warily. Here we go again. Luffy had stood up and made sure he was near Nami. If these bastards laid a single hand on her, he would kill them. Sanji stepped forwards to meet them. "Hold on a minute, what do you think you're doing?" he asked, lighting another cigarette. The man stopped before him. "You're not worth any money, so you're not worth my time." "Move it, cook," the man said, glaring at Sanji. Sanji chuckled. "You know, Judah Shanks," he said, stepping closer. "I may be a cook, but I'm still a pirate." He flashed the man a demonic smile. The man, to his credit, did not flinch. In fact, he kept a dead calm expression as he leveled his gun to Sanji's head and flipped the safety off. Sanji frowned, raising his hands. The man laughed. "You're all talk. I could shoot you, right here and now, and since I can see that you don't believe me, maybe I will." Something flashed in the man's eyes and everyone who caught it realized that he fully intended to do just that. Luffy stepped in front of Sanji, turning to his cook. "Keep an eye on Nami," he said, his voice low, serious. "Dangerous." Sanji nodded. "You know Luffy," he muttered. "I would kill to be bulletproof." Luffy just chuckled. The man looked down at Luffy, surprised. He turned to his men. "Look at this, boys. The small fry just became a 100 million berry wanted criminal. Now I've got to shoot him," he said. His men all cheered. The cold look glazed over the man's face once again and he lowered the gun to Luffy's chest. "Bye-bye Monkey D. Luffy," he said as he pulled the trigger. Gonzo, the small boy who had spoken to Luffy and Nami earlier, could not tear his eyes away from the fight. even when the man lowered his gun to the captain's chest. The captain's eyes could not be seen, as they were shadowed by his dark hair, but he was looking down with a small smile on his face. Bye-bye Monkey D. Luffy, the man said. There was a loud bang as he pulled the trigger. The small boy yelped in fright, his eyes filling with tears. No way, he couldn't have just done that. As tears streamed down his cheeks, Gonzo watched Luffy. He gasped. The smile was still there. In fact, it was spreading into a devilish grin. He raised his head to meet the other man's eyes. You didn't think that one through, now did you? He said. You see, I'm a rubber man, and what do you think is going to happen now? The man looked down at the spot where he had shot Straw Hat Luffy. The bullet had passed right through him, and was currently stretching out his back. The bullet stopped moving and then suddenly started flinging back the other direction. The man screamed as the bullet hurtled back towards him. He closed his eyes and shielded his face. Luffy began to laugh. The man stayed frozen like that for a while before he opened one eye and peered out through his hands. Luffy was throwing the bullet up and catching it, grinning at him. I really had you there. Hey man, he said, chuckling. The man watched the bullet in awe. Gonzo had seen the entire scene play out, but he still could not believe what had happened. The pirate had caught the bullet. But that was not humanly possible, right? Who was this guy? Luffy, don't go scaring people like that, the man called Zoro scolded. He was leaning carelessly against the pool table, his swords in his lap. Luffy laughed. Yeah, sorry, he did shoot me though. The girl came up beside him. Yeah, but you can't be shot, so it doesn't count, she proclaimed. It doesn't do me any damage, but it's pretty damn annoying. He whined in his childish tone, no longer serious. He turned his back on the group and wandered back over to the corner with Nami and Sanji. The man collapsed onto his knees. Zoro got the game of pool started back up, despite the other participants still being in shock, and after a while the room got a bit of a buzz back. The group that had entered sat down where they were to recover from their shock. Gonzo ran up to Luffy and threw his arms around his legs, sobbing. Luffy looked shocked but picked the kid up anyway, smiling. He chuckled. What's up, kid? He asked, holding him up above his head. The kid sniffed. I thought he was going to kill you. The kid whined. Luffy laughed again, putting the small boy down and ruffling his hair. You know, kid, it takes a lot to kill me. Nobody's managed to do it so far, and I intend to keep the streak. Plus, do you really think I would have let him shoot me if it would have hurt? I'm not suicidal, he laughed. The kid gave him a watery smile. His mother came hurrying up and picked the kid up. I'm sorry about Gonzo, she said to Luffy, lowering her gaze so as not to meet his eyes. She was clearly afraid of him, but Luffy didn't pay it any attention. Haha, no problem lady, he said, waving to the kid. Then he turned to his cook. Oi Sanji, is there any food left? He asked. Sanji nodded, pointing to the bench where some people were still being served. Where stories live, discover now.